Okay, welcome everyone to the next LEEF meeting. So far, we've had great success with these virtual meetings, and we've received attendance from across Pennsylvania and the Great Lakes and even the Mid-Atlantic region. I encourage you to write in the chat today what city and state you are tuning into from while I go over some of the logistics for the day. Most of us are pretty familiar with Zoom by now, but if you have questions, please direct them to the Q&A, which is in the lower portion of your screen. The chat is functional as well and could be used for, typing in song suggestions like we were just talking about. But if you type a question into the Q&A, it might not get answered right away because they tend to get buried, whereas the Q&A box saves your question until it gets answered. And today, if we don't get to your question, we will pass them along to the appropriate presenter and share those responses with you. And presenters, feel free to reply to questions directly in the Q&A if you feel so inclined. This meeting is being recorded, and the recording and the notes from the meeting will be available on Pennsylvania Sea Grant's website within the next few weeks. So with that, I will turn it over to Tim for some Great Lake updates.
Wonderful. Thank you, Amber. And I join you in welcoming everyone to the October 2022 meeting of the Pennsylvania Lake Erie Environmental Forum. My name is Tim Bruno. I serve as the Chief of the Office of the Great Lakes for the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. And for those of you who are new to the Pennsylvania LEEF, this forum hosts informational sessions that allow participants to gain a deeper knowledge and appreciation of the environmental issues that affect our Great Lakes. We do this with not only special attention to those issues that affect our water quality and our water quantity, but also how they impact our lives and our communities. We strive to bring you some of the leading experts within the Great Lakes Basin and sometimes outside of it, so that you can take that knowledge with you and share what you've learned with your family, your friends, neighbors, and colleagues. Today's topics of hazard mitigation and how people and maybe operations may migrate in the face of a changing climate, both here and around the country, are of particular interest both to me, but also I believe will become increasingly important to both Pennsylvania and the Great Lakes region. So for today, I'll provide a few Great Lakes updates, but as always, I'm open to any questions or conversation after today's meeting. You can contact me directly by email at tibruno@pa.gov, or at my cell phone, 717-798-6001. So first, for those who are joining us for the first time, just a very quick word about the DEP Office of the Great Lakes. And so in normal times, we're at the head of Presque Isle in the Tom Ridge Environmental Center here in Erie. But for the last 2 years, the office has been remote, and we look to continue that in the future. The office has a focus on Great Lakes water quality and quantity and linking that community, the community to the resource. We coordinate with US and Canadian federal agencies and other states and provinces to address water quality, water use, and policy opportunities and challenges. We work within Great Lakes governance structures, including federal organizations, interstate compacts, and international bodies to assure Pennsylvania's voice is well represented. We also place emphasis on forming local community partnerships to encourage municipal and county cooperation and protect the environment. This helps develop stronger communities, both for today and tomorrow. Likewise, we develop water and land protection programs and help bring in and prioritize funding to Pennsylvania. Now, during our previous meeting in April 2022, we discussed the threat of invasive carp entering the Great Lakes and the potential effects that would have on our food web, the fishery, and the recreation and boating sectors of our economy. DEP, as well as the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission and Governor Wolf's office, have been dedicated to assuring that invasive carp deterrents at the Brandon Road Lock and Dam in Joliet, Illinois, are constructed as soon as possible and funded in a way that reflects both the national significance of the project, as well as all of the additional environmental and social impacts that it would have. Since 2019, Pennsylvania has been involved in high-level negotiations between the Great Lakes states and provinces. These have been convened by the Great Lakes Commission, Illinois, and Michigan to move the Brandon Road project forward in a way that respects each jurisdiction's concerns and interests, while also reflecting the fiscal equity among the parties. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers will dedicate over $225 million of that agency's allotment from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act to the Brandon Road Lock and Dam project, completing both the design and engineering and allowing for the first construction phase. The total project is estimated at $858 million, but there is an awareness that these costs have likely increased due to the current economic climate. Governor Wolf and 7 other Great Lakes governors sent a support letter to the U.S. Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, as well as the U.S. House of Representatives Transportation and Infrastructure Committee that supported 100% full federal funding authorization for the Brandon Road Interbasin project. And that was to be included in the Water Resources and Development Act of 2022. This bill is commonly referred to as WRDA. Recent drafts of that bill include a federal, non-federal cost share for the project of 90% to 10%, which would still leave the states responsible for a significant sum. So there's more to come on this topic in following months as we see the legislative process play out. Moving on now to water use and water quantity, the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence River Basin Water Resources Compact and Agreement are led by 2 entities, the Compact Council and Regional Body. These are the Interstate Compact Agency and International Body that are charged with the oversight of water use, water diversions, and conservation and efficiency of the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence River. Pennsylvania is currently serving as chair for both these organizations until our next meeting in December 2022. We held our last meeting in Erie on June 16th, and we received updates regarding the every 5-year cumulative impact assessment as to how our water use is affecting the Great Lakes, as well as science and research components that would allow greater understanding and estimation of the water balance within the system. These are topics which closely tie into the themes that we'll be hearing from our presenters today, and I'm looking forward to. The next meetings of these entities will be held in Quebec City in December and are always open to the public. Information to join the meeting will be posted at www.glslcompactcouncil.org and www.glslregionalbody.org. And an update as to our 2021 water year water use and withdrawals here in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania reported water withdrawals and water use at 29.3 million gallons per day. And this is yet again the lowest amount since the inception of the compact in 2008. We continually see our water use trending downward as we gain efficiencies inside of our public water use systems. And as we see a decline in the overall industrial water use inside of our state. Turning now to another topic that will closely relate to our presentations today is the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Great Lakes Coastal Resiliency Study. On September 28th, the Great Lakes states and the Army Corps entered into a historic watershed study cost share agreement that will initiate the Great Lakes Coastal Resiliency Study that's aimed at protecting the economic, environmental, and social value of the 5,200 miles of Great Lakes coast. Vulnerable coastal resources will be identified and mapped, and measures and actions will be evaluated and recommended in this report. And so congratulations to the Pennsylvania DEP Coastal Resources Management Program, who have really spearheaded the effort for Pennsylvania and coordinating with the other states and the Corps for all of their hard work and success in getting this agreement in place. Turning now to water quality and the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. As I mentioned at our last meeting, April 15th of this year marked the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement between the US and Canada. The landmark agreement has been effective in improving and protecting the water quality of the Great Lakes, achieving dramatic reductions in toxic substances in the environment and improving fish and wildlife habitat. The 50-year anniversary celebration was held in Niagara Falls, Ontario on September 27th through 29th. and coincided with the triennial Great Lakes Public Forum. This event was held both in person and virtually, and the updates can be found on www.binational.net. The Annex 2 subcommittee of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, that is commonly referred to as the Lake-Wide Action and Management Plan Annex, the LAMP Annex, will be examining the individual management plans for each of the Great Lakes and determining how to move forward. Lake Erie's LAMP was adopted late. It was supposed to be adopted in, I believe, 2019. Rather, it was only finalized in 2021. And it's back on the schedule for an update. These things are updated every 5 years. But it's likely, since we had such a late adoption, that the 2021 document will continue with minor changes. But that is still left to be determined, and more information will be coming from that. The Annex 4 subcommittee, the Nutrients Annex, assembled the 2021 Lake Erie point and non-point source phosphorus discharge data for each of the states in the province of Ontario. Summaries of this information can be viewed on the Great Lakes Commission's Erie Stat webpage. It can be found at www.blueaccounting.org /issue/Erie Stat. We look at gauges to the overall phosphorus loading to Lake Erie during the previous year in this process. And 2021's loading to the Western and Central Basins was estimated at 6,797 metric tons per annum. This is moving closer to the 6,000 metric ton per annum target that was set by the Annex 4 subcommittee back in 2014 and 15. Pennsylvania's loading to the Central Basin remained roughly static during this past year, consisting of approximately 40 metric tons per annum between point and non-point sources. You can see this is just a mere fraction of the overall loading to that basin. So with that, I will turn it back over to Amber Stillwell, and we'll move on with our agenda and get our first speaker announced for today.
Thank you, Tim. And I encourage you to type your questions for Tim into the chat. There is one question, Tim. Who will be working on the Lake Erie LAMP?
So we will have representation from DEP staff working on that LAMP document, and we haven't determined who that will be yet. It's usually a cooperation between both Harrisburg staff and Northwest Regional staff, but we'll see on that, and I'm happy to answer questions as soon as we know.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm now pleased to move to our first speaker. We have Terry Schwartz and Nicholas Rakovich. I knew I was going to get that wrong. I'm sorry. So they are going to be presenting to us about climate change in migration and hazard mitigation. Terry Schwartz is the director of Kent State University's Cleveland Urban Design Collaborative. Her work at the CUDC includes neighborhood and campus planning, commercial and residential design guidelines, and ecological strategies for vacant land reuse. She teaches in the graduate curriculum for the KSU College of Architecture and Environmental Design. Nicholas Rakovich is an associate professor in the School of Architecture and Planning at the University of Buffalo. He is currently the building's sector co-chair for the New York State Climate Impacts Assessment that examines how the built environment of the Northeast US will need to adapt to climate change. He also supported organizations like the American Institute of Architects and the US Green Building Council as they incorporate resilience into their programs. So thank you, Terry and Nick, for joining us today, and we look forward to hearing everything you have to teach us.
Thanks, Amber. And no worries about the last name. It took me till I was about 14 years old to figure out how to pronounce my last name. So you did just fine on the second go. So I appreciate the effort. Thank you to everybody who's joining us on the call today. We're happy to share some recent research that we've been doing at Kent State University, at the Cleveland Urban Design Collaborative, and also at the University at Buffalo. I'm going to kind of kick off the presentation and talk a little bit about some of the background issues related to climate change in the Great Lakes region. After listening to Tim's presentation about phosphorus loading in Lake Erie and other locations, realize I'm talking to some really significant scientists, I think, on the call today. So just fair warning, I'm an architect and planner, and so we tend to talk about things in a much more general terms as they relate to issues of migration. We had a really fantastic team that we pulled together for this project from the CUDC, which Terry's representing, the University of Buffalo. But the project itself was supported by the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, which gave us the primary grant to begin to look at this issue. And we're hoping to work with them again in the future as we're developing some additional ideas. But also Cuyahoga County, Ohio, which is where Cleveland is located, contributed a significant amount of support and also effort to make this project a reality. So why are we talking about issues, related to climate change, in the Great Lakes region? Why are we kind of concerned about the possibility of people migrating in the future? A lot of it comes back to discussions that we have really every time we have major disasters in the United States, of how these disasters are growing over time and how it's resulting in additional losses to property. And so the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, has published, and they actually have a great website where you can actually go and begin to download information to understand which of the different natural hazards have started to cause damage. And what we've seen is that the number of billion-dollar-plus disasters has definitely increased over time. Part of that increase is certainly due to the fact that people have moved in the past to more vulnerable locations, and that we've had more buildings built in those different types of locations. But part of it is also linked certainly to a warming of the atmosphere and a changing climate. And the concern going forward is that we're going to see, hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars of loss coming from these in the future. And most recently with Hurricane Ian, and causing tens of billions of dollars of damage in Florida. Why that is of concern is certainly that the news, related to climate is not great. And as we look at what is happening with some of the key indicators of the climate, one of the things I like to say with the students is, no matter what scenario we're looking at, no matter what representative concentration pathway in terms of atmospheric warming we're seeing, the changes are all look kind of catastrophic. So in terms of what we're seeing for global average surface temperature change, those are all beginning to increase over time. Sea level rise is certainly expected to increase over time. Loss of sea ice in the Northern Hemisphere, is projected in some scenarios to really have no sea ice by the end of, as we get to the end of this century. And then also acidification of the oceans. And all of these things, contribute to vulnerability, especially of coastal communities, where a lot of people have relocated in the past in the US. So as we start to think about, what's going to happen in the future, can we start to plan for people moving under different climate-related scenarios? And I think one of the things that Terry and I have seen happening, and a lot of people are talking about, is that the Great Lakes have been a place that have been relatively free from these different types of disasters. While that's potentially a good thing, there's still a lot of inaccuracy that's actually built into some of these different models. Where we'd like to be is to have highly accurate and highly precise models to begin to describe what is happening not only with the climate, but also with where people are going to migrate to. Where we probably are right now is more of a low precision in terms of understanding who and why they're moving, but also where folks are moving. What we really don't want to have is something that's highly precise, but completely wrong. And today, we probably have something that's a mix of having accurate predictions, but a low precision about exactly what's going to happen in each individual city. And that's also important because as we talk about different natural hazards, we tend to attribute a lot of different things to a changing climate. And right now, the current state of the science in terms of attribution science is that only a handful of things like extreme heat and extreme cold have been closely tied to climate change. All of the other things that are kind of listed on this chart in terms of the extreme snow and ice, tropical cyclones, things like droughts or wildfires are a science that's emerging. We expect in the future to see all of these different types of hazards be more closely linked to a changing climate, but that's going to take time and statistical analysis to move it in that direction. And so because of some of those different imprecisions, it's important to not just talk about our preferred scenarios for climate change, that the Great Lakes is going to potentially be a refuge, but really to consider a wide range of options. One of the things that Terry is going to, kind of start off her presentation talking about a little bit is as people look at the different maps of where hazards are happening in the United States, you tend to see that fewer of those hazards are actually occurring in places like the Great Lakes region, and especially in the lower Great Lakes region. And so as we look at things like that we're expected to see with climate change in the future, things like hot weather, we see a large portions of the region at only kind of low to moderate risk. Other things like dry weather, which is certainly, impacting large portions of the Southwest and California, is something that we're blessed with not necessarily having those issues in the future. And other things like having overflowing rivers from precipitation events, while those are certainly localized issues, we're not seeing them at the same extent we see in places like the Mississippi River Valley. Other things like hurricanes are fortunately pretty much limited to the coasts. The damage that we've seen in the past from hurricanes that have happened in our region have primarily been from the heavy rainfall events that have followed the storms as they've moved into the Northeast. So believe it or not, things like Hurricane Sandy actually did do quite a bit of damage in places like Buffalo and Cleveland, but it was from the flooding and things associated with that. And other hazards, certainly that capture national news attention, things like wildfires, other than the upper peninsula of Michigan and the upper portions of Michigan, we tend to see much lower risk, certainly, than what we start to see out west. So because of these types of data and because, other things like understanding that we're far away from the coasts and not going to see sea level rise, a lot of different researchers have started to postulate that we'll see an influx of people moving here in the future. And one of the things that we try to take on with this project, and that Terry is going to talk about in a lot more detail, is to actually, start to think about what those scenarios actually start to mean. So with that brief introduction in play, I just want to turn it over to Terry, and Terry can start sharing her slides to talk a little bit more detail about what we did for this project with the Lincoln Institute. Terry?
Thanks, Nick. So I'm going to pick up where Nick just ended, which is to say, let me do this. Okay. Which is to say that there's a lot of uncertainty when Nick was talking about being, kind of precise and accurate. I'm a city planner by training, and it's really hard to predict the future because there are so many factors at play. But as long as I've lived in Cleveland, which has been, quite a long time at this point, we keep hearing this kind of narrative played out in a lot of conversations around, kind of when conditions get really bad out west, with the drought or wildfires or hurricanes and sea level rise, well, then people are going to come back. And so when we launched this project, it was really to put a little bit of nuance into that conversation. Like, what do we mean when we say people are going to come back? Who are these people? Where are they coming from? What would keep them from moving back to the Great Lakes? And how do we prepare for a possible future where we might either see, kind of a continuation of trends that have been in place for the last several decades in the cities of the Great Lakes, which has been largely around deindustrialization and depopulation. So how do we plan for that moment that, kind of we're already in, while at the same time anticipating this possible future where we might see an increase in population as well as businesses and resources moving to our region? or we might not. So how do we, kind of how do we deal with the here and now at the same time while we plan for some possibilities? So this map was produced at Penn, that was just kind of saying the same thing that some of the maps that Nick just showed, is that parts of the country are prone to kind of disasters, and relatively speaking, the Great Lakes is fairly stable. I take this map with a little bit of a grain of salt because it makes Cleveland and a lot of our neighboring cities look like we're, kind of exempt from a lot of the risks. We do experience quite a lot of flooding, as well as, kind of an increase in high heat days and the potential for heat waves that can be really damaging in a place where, kind of you have lots of impoverished residents, older housing stock, lots of pavement, and not enough air conditioning, the same kind of heat wave that would hit Phoenix or Las Vegas, and people would take it in stride because they're prepared for it. In cities like Cleveland and Youngstown, Detroit and Buffalo, we are less prepared for high heat. So one of the questions that we are striving to ask, through this work is kind of who are these potential climate refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants, recognizing that those are all different groups of people. People may arrive in the aftermath of a disaster, having lost everything and needing a great deal of support, or people may see the opportunity to tap into the vast resource, which is the Great Lakes, and kind of move to the region with resources. Two different kinds of challenges, right? If people arrive here with lots of needs, do we have the ability to support those needs? And if people arrive with lots of resources, how do we manage gentrification issues and keeping existing residents who've been here for a long time from being pushed out of the more stable areas where they may be living now into more vulnerable parts of our region? We also looked a little bit about, or thought a little bit about how, kind of family ties, ethnicity, and social connections might impact human movement. So this is also from the work at the McHarg Center at the University of Pennsylvania. This is the diaspora after Hurricane Katrina, which shows that when people left New Orleans in the aftermath of that terrible disaster, people went all over the country, but the biggest line here, the reddest line, went from New Orleans to Houston, which, may not have solved their problem, right? I mean, if you are leaving Hurricane Katrina conditions and you move to Houston, and 12 years later, then similar conditions affect you there. This slide is just meant to suggest that when people relocate, they don't always relocate from a, kind of climate safety perspective. In a lot of cases, people move to an area that is at least as vulnerable, if not more so, than the place that they were moving from. Similarly, this is a weather map from the summer. There was extremely high heat through much of the West and Southwest this summer. While it was actually fairly nice here in the lakes, in the Great Lakes this summer, but I guess I took that one out. A lot of the people who moved from California seem to have been, if we watch the housing trends, moving to Phoenix. Again, suggesting that, kind of climate isn't the main driver of people's migration. It might be employment opportunities, family ties, housing costs, lots of things affect people's decisions about where to live. So this is all just to say that, we can't assume that just because the Great Lakes may be relatively more stable from a climate perspective than other parts of the country, that people will just naturally move here. This is from Buffalo. Buffalo in the last census, and Nick can speak to this better than I, saw an uptick in population for the first time in decades. And there's some thought that that might have been in part due to people from Puerto Rico relocating after Hurricane Maria. So it's not to say that when people leave a disaster site, when they're uprooted by a natural disaster, that they kind of automatically go someplace near or someplace familiar. Probably the jump from kind of Puerto Rico to Buffalo was pretty jarring for a lot of people. Anyway, So one of the things, sorry, I'm not sure why it's doing this. Okay, there we go. So our project around scenario planning, in scenario planning, there are different ways to do it. Normative scenario planning is the kind of traditional way that people do scenario planning, which focuses on a preferred future outcome and then plans for how you can get to that preferred end state. Predictive scenario planning looks at a variety of different options and tries to anticipate, if we do these things, what the future might look like. For our work, we're looking at exploratory scenario planning, which simply says there are lots of things that could happen in the future. Why don't we explore some areas of uncertainty to see if we can outline some, kind of possible futures, things that could happen, not necessarily that we want to happen or will happen, but that are possible, so that if we anticipate those possibilities, we can begin to plan for them. So the nice thing about exploratory scenario planning compared to the other two models is that it is much easier to implement, particularly in a community context. My organization is the Outreach Division for the College of Architecture. So we spend a lot of time at that community level around the table, really talking with community residents, business owners, stakeholders about what they envision for the place where they live. So the nice thing about exploratory scenario planning is that it's not extremely technical. It's narrative based, and here I can show you sort of what we mean by that. But the reality is that the further we look out into the future, the more uncertainty there is. And exploratory scenario planning is particularly helpful when navigating a lot of variables. So in our work, we just started to outline some of the things that communities in our region might be uncertain about. We don't know if population is going to continue to decline or to grow, if we would see a gradual influx of people moving to the Great Lakes Basin, or a sudden influx in the aftermath of, kind of a disaster happening elsewhere in the country or the world. We don't know if people would be arriving to the region with lower incomes and lots of needs, or higher incomes and lots of demands, younger families aging. I'm not going to go through all of these, but there's a lot of things that we don't know about what could happen, as well as a lot of things we don't know about climate in our region, because even though we think about the Great Lakes as a relatively stable place, the climate's changing here too, and so we don't know if the climate changes are going to be moderate or extreme. So for the guide to scenario planning, which is the document that Nick and I put together, we actually just kind of played out a couple of scenarios just as examples. We didn't do an actual community process. We just sort of outlined how that process could work. So for instance, a community might be exploring, kind of two different uncertainties. One is, is the city going to grow or decline? And then on the other axis, will the climate impacts be moderate or will they be extreme? So in each of those then quadrants, we can begin thinking about, kind of what the implications of that would be. So if we had a growing population and severe climate impacts. Again, because it's exploratory, the way that this might, take place in a community is, kind of around a table or around a whiteboard where people can, kind of think about, well, okay, if we have severe climate impacts and a growing population, what are all the things that we're going to need to think about and prepare for? What are the risks? What are the possible benefits? To begin just sort of laying out some of those things, recognizing that none of these four scenarios shown on this diagram are ideal, and none of them are completely, kind of terrible. They all have, potential positive aspects and things that could be really difficult to deal with. Here's just another one I'll show you really quickly. This one's more maybe at a regional scale, where we would be looking at, is the region's population going to grow? In a lot of Great Lakes metropolitan areas, the region has remained pretty stable, maybe slightly growing or slightly declining. But what if we saw, kind of an influx at the regional level in population, or at the other end of the arrow, a decline in regional population? And then in the other axis, we would be looking at, kind of would the population of our region, especially if the population is growing, would the incoming population be accommodated through infill development in existing cities, suburbs, and towns in our region? Or would we see this exurban focus, this kind of sprawling pattern of development if we saw large numbers of people coming to our region? So for the sake of, kind of, again, demonstrating what these things could look like, there are lots of ways through Post-it notes, through mapping, through image making, through storytelling, that you can kind of begin to envision these alternative futures. So I'm just going to show you kind of quickly. This is that top right-hand corner. If we had a growing population and that population was going to be, kind of accommodated at the outer edges of our region. So, kind of we might start to see the older existing communities where the housing stock is not weatherized, not air conditioned, and not particularly energy efficient, that we could see, kind of sort of a hollowing out of those historic communities and new cities. I show this image of Masdar sort of ironically, I guess, but the idea is that we could begin to see whole new communities building, kind of taking shape at the outer edges of urbanized regions in the Great Lakes if we are accommodating large numbers of people. And again, there could be real advantages to that in terms of energy efficiency. We could, kind of envision these communities as being well served by transit, kind of a net zero development happening at the periphery, but it also comes at a great cost in terms of the disinvestment and vacancy at the city centers. Similarly, if we had a declining population and continued exurban development, this is sort of the condition that we live in today, the kind of continuous outward development, fewer people taking up more land across the region, and particularly, kind of the ways that that would have impacts on energy usage in the region. And then, kind of envisioning what if we had a growing population and we tried to fit them into the fabric of existing communities. It's hard to do. This is a big part of the work that we do at the CUDC, and trying to fit development into existing areas is challenging, even though we have in Cleveland 30,000 vacant lots. They're never exactly where you need them, and it's hard to assemble larger parcels. And so if we saw a large influx of residents to the city of Cleveland, for instance, it would be really difficult to accommodate that growth of residents and businesses, just because of the challenges of land assembly and industrial contamination and other challenges. But it could be done, assuming that the influx of population would happen gradually. If it happened all at once, this would be really difficult to do. And then possibility of doing, kind of a growing population and infill for housing. Again, kind of in a scattered site way, we could accommodate residents here, but it would be hard to do with like thousands and thousands of people. And then the last scenario here is just envisioning, kind of a continued decline in population in our region, and somehow kind of restructuring the surplus real estate within the urban footprint in ways that, kind of increase the climate resiliency of the region by managing flooding and urban heat island effects, et cetera. Lastly, I'll just end here by saying that, kind of how do we know kind of which scenario is unfolding? So in our guide to scenario planning, we outline some resources that city officials and planners can use to kind of track what's happening on the ground in their communities, so you can, kind of get out ahead of things. It's hard to sort of see a trend when you're in the middle of it, but sort of some of the factors to look for. Our publication is available through the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy's website. It's a very, very long URL, but if you just Google exploratory scenario planning and Lincoln Institute, you can find it pretty easily. So with that, Nick, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thanks, Terry. So trying to cue this back up. So one question did come in the chat while you're presenting, and just from Freda Tepfer was just asking about how do we know how climate change is impacting the amount and duration of snowfall in Erie? there have been a number of studies that have been done, like by the University of Michigan and others, that have shown basically with a warming lake and also the potential for changes in the jet stream related to Arctic sea ice loss, that you potentially set up in the future more opportunities for heavy lake effect rain and heavy lake effect snow events. And what we just, in Buffalo where I live, we actually just had a series of days where we had a lot of lake effect rain that happened. And we're only like 2 or 3 degrees away from potentially all of that coming down from the atmosphere as really heavy snow, which in the past, when that's happened, we actually called it the October surprise in Buffalo. It did tens of millions of dollars of damage, in addition to destroying a lot of our tree canopy in the city that still really hasn't recovered from that. So I am sharing on the screen, hopefully. So hopefully everybody can see the slides that I'm showing right now. So taking what I said earlier and what Terry is talking about in terms of beginning to prepare for people coming into the region, I think one of the things that both Terry and I felt was really important to talk about, as we're working through this, is that we still do face quite a few hazards in the Great Lakes region. It isn't like we're completely safe, because of things, but also to understand that we're tied into a global economy. And so, what happens in other parts of the United States certainly are going to impact us. I'm just going to kind of close out our presentation here today by going through a couple slides and talking about some of the ways that we're thinking about adapting to climate change in the region. And a lot of that starts with this very typical diagram, which is about understanding hazards, moving to understand vulnerabilities and risks within our communities, looking at options, and then beginning to prioritize and plan for that. While this lays out a really nice, clean kind of 5-point circle, that we're supposed to go through the process, there are some important things that we have to take into account that we might not consider. So the first thing, in terms of looking at what some of these hazards are, I showed earlier that, while the Great Lakes region in particular has a fewer number of these hazards, we still do have a lot of these things being possible. Again, while we're not expecting in the future to have a hurricane directly impact the Great Lakes, the rainfall that comes from a post-tropical storm certainly can cause a lot of flooding within our region and other things. If we do see droughts or things like that in the future, having more wildfire possible in places like the Adirondacks or even in places where we have more grasslands, and certainly seeing migration of different pests northward. While that may seem like on the surface, while that's like, having ticks or things like that is more of a public health issue, as we've seen in many cities with things like the emerald ash borer, it actually can cause great ecological damage to our environment, and then consequently also to the built environment when those trees and things like that are damaged and actually become kind of like projectiles during storm types of events. So getting a handle on these different types of hazards that we do face, and understanding specifically within our region or specifically within our cities what types of hazards we're going to see, is an important second part of that process. As I mentioned before, with attribution science, there are a lot of other hazards, a lot of different hazards that are out there. There's different levels of confidence in terms of our attribution of those to climate change, but not all of those things are necessarily tied to the hazards that currently organizations like FEMA are looking at right now. So the ones that are listed at the top, the things like heat waves, cold waves, all the way down to sea level rise, right? All of those things are things that are currently being looked at as part of the National Risk Index. But there are other things certainly going forward that we have to start talking about as well, that are definitely things that can impact some of our cities in the Great Lakes region. Things like coastal flooding. We've seen in the spring where I live in Niagara County, really significant coastal flooding associated with both high water, but also wind that's driven and pushed as a seiche. Things like indoor environmental quality, so greater risk for mold and moisture coming into buildings. And again, things like pests. And these are all things that come back to our region and all stuff that we have to begin to deal with. Terry also alluded to, planning equitably within cities and understanding where and how we assess vulnerability within those locations. And a lot of times people talk about things like a legacy of redlining in cities in the Great Lakes region, which is when banks used to actually create maps where they would not provide investments, would not provide mortgages. And that has kind of locked in a certain amount of inequity. In the first image on the left is one of the redlining maps from the 1930s. But you can see in the second map, which is in the middle, which is actually where I live in Buffalo, New York, that's locked in some significant segregation in our city. Buffalo is actually estimated as being now the 6th most segregated city in the United States. These types of things, you're putting populations in the places that tend to have higher risks, that tend to have greater risk for flooding or other kinds of issues. But the third image, the third map there that's on the right, is important to point out. This isn't just a legacy of redlining. This is actually something that still continues today in terms of where we're providing investments. And so that's actually a map from a bank that in 2015 had to settle with the New York State government because they were still taking and doing these types of practices. So thinking about our most vulnerable communities is really important in terms of making sure not only we're ready to accept other people migrating or becoming refugees to the region, but also keeping the people here safe as possible. Other reasons why, assessing that vulnerability is really important. A lot of different studies have looked at climate-related risk in places that were redlined or yellow-lined in those older maps today. And so in places like Sacramento, New York, Boston, Detroit, which is certainly in the Great Lakes region, all of the risks in those locations are higher risks for flooding. So how we begin to do that, how we begin to mitigate and direct investments to those communities is really important. What's interesting in New York State is they've actually set aside 40% of the funding that will be used for adaptation to climate change in the future being directed specifically to those disadvantaged communities. And then, once we understand what the hazards are, and once we understand kind of locally within cities where that vulnerability and risk is, coming up with different strategies to begin to mitigate that risk is really important. So a lot of the work that we're doing right now at the University of Buffalo is going through and identifying these different strategies, developing descriptions that are easy to understand for a lot of different organizations, but also putting them into different terms for different stakeholders in the process. So as it relates to buildings, understanding how not only what the urban heat island effect is in terms of having higher temperatures in cities, but how owners and operators can begin to mitigate it, how policymakers and planners can begin to come up with things to execute neighborhood level heat island reduction strategies, et cetera, but also how architects and engineers at the very local site can begin to pull all of these pieces together. And really it is about getting all of those stakeholders involved in the process, because if any one of them is missing, it's potentially not going to be something that moves forward. One great example of bringing organizations together is the American Society of Adaptation Professionals. You can see a link at the lower right of the screen that talks, that will send you to their website. One of the things they've done is trying to understand how we can begin to build resilience through different funded projects. And they actually created a recent report that identified 10 different characteristics of projects that were ready to increase resilience. I'm not going to go through and read all 10 of these as part of the presentation, but I'll just say that the 4 main categories they found that were consistent across all of the projects were successful is that they had built those collaborative partnerships, that they had really intentional teams that were coming together and prioritizing equity in terms of decisions, but also co-developing ideas with members of the community, using innovative accounting and financing practices to make those projects go forward, but also trying to understand how these things connected to local government plans and having the right frameworks and policies in place to make them happen. This document and the link at the lower right is really worth checking out. And if you're interested in more and interested in adaptation within our region, I'd really suggest checking out their website to get a lot of additional potential contacts. So as we look at bringing all of these things together, we do really still have different hazards in our region that we need to begin to respond to. And as those move into understanding very locally places that have been redlined or at greater risk, these are important steps in that different process. Pulling together the options and the different strategies and thinking about all of the different stakeholders and prioritizing, planning, and using the best available knowledge. But it isn't also just about taking action at that point. We really have to learn and continue to kind of go through this cycle and process, because that really is the adaptive kind of co-management process. So for something that's really simple, it might be just kind of going back and continually updating and understanding what options we might have. And this is something that's called single loop learning. But really for much broader projects, and looking at this over time, it's where we're continuously coming back and updating and understanding our different hazards that we see, but also how vulnerabilities and risks are changing in our community. Because as we plan for these things are changing temporally, the hazards are changing over time, and that all has to kind of come together into something to make sure that we're applying the best available science to adaptation and resilience in our communities. So I think I'm going to stop there. And Amber, I don't know if you open it up for questions through the chat or how we want to do that. But thank you very much for giving us this chance.
Thank you so much for joining us. Tim and I are going to help you go through some of these questions. Tim, is there anything in there that you saw?
Yeah, I just wanted to start off with thanking both Nick and Terry for an excellent presentation. And it's accentuating some of the conversations that I've been seeing develop over the last 12 to 18 months on the Great Lakes amongst all of the states and the provinces and the federal governments. You touch a lot on the human migration components of, how do we know what goes into making that decision to physically move locations, and when do those occur? I think that, we certainly need more research and more studies, on the populations that are in these high stress climate and risk areas for us to better understand, what that diaspora looks like and how it happens over time. Where are those preferred next stops for people? Because we know that at least this is a very complicated individual decision for anyone when they decide they want to move from one place to another. How do you determine, what those thresholds and triggers are on a much larger mass level, and really kind of quantify those and how they would affect our region and our communities? In addition to that, the questions I had regarding water use, going off into the future, because that's one of our first of all, it's our greatest gift here. It's as a resource, it's very much one of those things that I think we take for granted in this region, and we don't think about in a lot of ways. The human migration component is certainly one where if you had more people in this area, they would consume more water. But the other one is that we have to be concerned about agricultural migration. And this is something that we heard about at the Great Lakes Commission meeting that occurred in Erie here just a couple of weeks ago. There was a couple of people on a panel, one from the U.S. Geological Survey, as well as Nick Schreck, who is from the University of Detroit Mercy. We have a lot of production of agriculture across the United States that is in these high risk areas where you'll be seeing less precipitation. You'll have a greater need for irrigation in those areas. And in some places, due to higher degree days, you would see those types of crops need to move to other places just because they're not sustainable in certain areas anymore due to lack of water, high heat, etc. And so I think like this agricultural migration may be even more of a concern for our region here, just due to the fact.
Tim, you muted by accident.
Oh, sorry about that. I don't know where I muted at.
I think you left off in talking about the impacts of agricultural migration and that being a big issue for the Great Lakes area.
So yeah, just understanding that in Southern California, in the Ogallala aquifer in our Midwestern states, those types of crops may very well move to the fallow lands that we see across the Great Lakes. But just going back to, and this will be my question for you guys, specifically in regards to human migration. Where do you think we are at in that process for planning for the longer term migration trends 10 to 20 years from now? And what are if you could name, 2 or 3 integral things that we must do as a region to plan for that going off into the future that we haven't done yet?
Nice softball question. Thank you. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if Terry will disagree with me. I think we're at the very earliest stages of starting to talk about planning for this issue. And I think most of the conversation right now is an economic development message. So when you look at, for instance, Cuyahoga County, which we worked with as part of this report, they developed a whole website called watereconomy.com, which is talking about how the region is relatively free of natural hazards and has access to a lot of fresh water. And so it's a good thing, it's a simple kind of message in terms of trying to attract businesses to the region. But the question about, what happens if that's successful, or what happens if climate doesn't behave exactly how we plan, I think is one thing that's not really being looked at yet. And part of the reason is, since at least the 1980s, if not earlier, most of our regions in the Great Lakes Basin, have been dealing with population loss. And so the entire thing is about trying to create jobs in the region. And I'm not really sure how we will all react if very suddenly there's a change. That said, I think one of the things in terms of how do we begin to plan, how do we begin to think about it, this isn't a technical question that any one discipline can begin to answer. And so I think trying to understand, insights not only from demographers, but also from historians is really important. And the example I would give is the Great Migration that happened, in the early part of the 20th century, up until the 1970s. We had large numbers of African Americans move from the South and move to industrial cities in the Northeast and in the Great Lakes region, because of jobs, industrial jobs. And so understanding what those motivations were, and how people began to migrate and, through family ties or through business related things, I think is important, maybe not as a way to predict what's going to happen, but to potentially know what performance indicators or things to look at as things are shifting in the future. So, Terry,
I just add real briefly that I'm completely in agreement, Nick, that there's so many things actually, Tim, that we need to do that we haven't really even just begun. So many communities, when you ask them about this kind of question, it becomes about marketing. I mean, some cities like Duluth, Minnesota, to some extent, kind of Cuyahoga County a little bit, Buffalo, Cincinnati, have already begun to kind of position themselves as climate havens. And that actually raises more questions than it answers. I mean, to me, I think the thing that we need to do, which feels a little hopeless at this divisive moment in time, is to begin to think about land use policy at the national level. And to, kind of begin to envision ways of, through policy and incentives, kind of encourage development and settlement in parts of the country that are best equipped to handle that. Because in the end, I mean, that's probably what it's going to take to actually do this in a rational way. More likely than not, I mean, we're just going to sort of see things happen in an unplanned way, which tends to be really devastating for the most vulnerable parts of our, kind of communities. So, it's a little bit, and it's hard also to be thinking at the scale that we operate at, the city, the neighborhood, the, kind of county and region, when the forces are really much bigger than that, The only other thing I'll add just really briefly is that one of the big variables here that we don't entirely know what's going to happen is with the Great Lakes Compact. I mean, potentially, kind of food production from elsewhere in the country could move into the Great Lakes Basin, or potentially some of the water from the Great Lakes could move out of our, kind of ecoregion. Both of those things come with challenges, I would think.
Yeah, most certainly agreed with that. And, having the protection of that compact is really important. As far as legal protections on a resource goes, that's about as strong as you can get. Is it bulletproof? Nothing is bulletproof when it comes to legal protections. But I think as far as what the states and the provinces have tried to do to ensure that water does not move out of the basin is pretty much as we possibly could do at this time. So, and I agree with you, hey, Nick. I just wanted to follow up with you on one of those things. Is you brought up two important things: historians and demographics, and understanding how we've responded in the past as mass groups of people, and to events that cause us to rethink where we live. Are there any other? Because I think what each one of those things does is it creates a threshold and a trigger, right? There's a threshold in which an individual and groups of people decide that this is enough. We need to physically move to somewhere else because the challenges are too great in front of us for staying here. And then there's also that that trigger that actually makes you do follow through with that. Who should be responsible for really trying to, first of all, research that, and then second of all, create those plans that are necessary that disseminate that data to the people who need it to plan for the future.
Also, thank you for another softball question, Tim. That's really.
I'm not known for easy questions.
No, yeah, I like where this is going. So no warm up, just cut right to the chase. So, no, I think the question about what is happening versus what ought we do about it are two very different kind of things, and that is actually part of the great challenge. Because I think it's in some ways it's easy to develop ways to understand through qualitative and quantitative methods, like why people are moving and where they're moving from. And some of the research that's being done right now, they're tracking change of address forms to understand who's moving and what those macro trends are. And certainly some people are starting to do interviews with refugees and other things like that, to understand why did they move or pick a certain location. So I think that's one piece that demographers and sociologists and things and historians can do a really good job of understanding those issues. The question what ought we or should we do about that really puts it into planning, and I think that's where it's a really difficult conversation, and it's land use planning in the United States. I think the reason why Terry was talking about this being more of a federal issue is we're really probably not going to solve this on a city by city basis, or even on a small regional basis, because there's too many macro issues that are going on where we have to see coordination among different organizations. And a good example of that is, Buffalo, New York, our mayor here has advertised Buffalo as being open for business and ready to be a climate haven. And we've started to see some population growth. If you go 30 minutes north of here to Niagara Falls, you're still seeing really significant population loss. And so the idea that, one city is a climate haven and the other one is not, even when there's really no difference climatically or geographically between the two locations, means that other things are going on. And it also means that what we don't want to have happen is just continue to have more sprawl at the periphery or people moving into locations, because the net impacts on water quality and other issues are still going to be significant. So getting folks together and talking about these things and researching it is one piece, but I think looking at like maybe getting the states that are involved in the compact in Canada to say, what are the long-term strategies for these things going forward? That's what's really needed, but also what's really, really difficult to make happen just, because of how our policies are set up in our countries.
That's a really good transition. I'll move over to some of the comments in the chat here. And this, I think, goes toward some of what Terry spoke about also, is, that interaction between planners and, the exploratory scenario planning and understanding what communities need and what's just for communities also. But Freda Tepfer mentioned that, the inside of Erie here, they're concerned regarding blight management and then, not only that, but also some of these planning mechanisms might pave the way for gentrification of other areas. It's kind of what you mentioned, Nick, is that in Buffalo, you're seeing gains in some places, you're still seeing losses or stagnation in others. So, what's the best way and process do you both see that we can do things in an equitable, just manner that provides for proper planning and, delivery of essentially, those services to the public?
You want me to take a shot at that there, Nick?
Yeah, that's another hard one. I don't want 3 in a row. So
I mean, one of the things that, kind of we've seen for decades in the, kind of cities of the Great Lakes is this kind of idea of population loss and then urban vacancy, right? And so in a lot of ways, cities like Cleveland and Detroit and Buffalo and Philadelphia have begun experimenting almost by necessity with alternative land use strategies that take into account the capacity of the land. One of the things that we've been really interested here in Cleveland is the way that, kind of vacant land can contribute to stormwater management. We don't call that a climate strategy, but it absolutely is, because one of the biggest risks to our region is an increase in flooding. So if some of these sort of smaller scale experiments happening in the, kind of older industrial cities that have already lost population, because aside from Youngstown, most cities, kind of aren't talking about like planning for a smaller city. It's really about how you manage these growing land banks, these growing inventories of surplus real estate in a way that prepares for some kind of future use. So if we look at the, kind of the land that's available, kind of at the regional scale, and begin to kind of put in place policies that protect the most valuable parts of the urban ecosystem from future development, then we can look at what we've got left to work with. And hopefully, kind of cities and regions working in that planning framework can begin to kind of target opportunities for development in the parts of the region where they'll have the do the least harm and hopefully create the most benefit for the health of the Great Lakes Basin. To the equity part of that, I mean, once we've kind of developed some clarity around, kind of what really we shouldn't build back on, I mean, Cleveland's lost about, 500,000 plus people. So, theoretically, does that mean 500,000 people could move back into the city? Probably not easily, not given the legacy of industrial contamination, et cetera. But if we could understand, kind of the real estate we have, kind of how we think about strategically what to protect in order to reduce the effects of rising heat, to manage, kind of the heavier precipitation. And then with what remains, thinking about all of those kinds of questions about how you kind of develop housing strategies so that people aren't pushed out of stable parts of a region into more vulnerable areas. Put those protections in place now so that if we do see this influx of population that could be happening, that we're prepared for it rather than reacting to it as it, kind of as it happens. I don't know, Nick, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is there was a really hard pivot when we went from growth strategies to thinking about thinning or shrinking cities. And now there's potentially another really challenging pivot, that happens in the future. But unfortunately, that pivot is probably not going to be as clear when it starts to happen or if it actually starts to happen. And so I think one of the really powerful things about this exploratory scenario planning is looking at all of those different possible outcomes and saying these things work under every single one of these different scenarios. And so like Terry's talking about, like preserving open land for stormwater management or things like that, that's something we need, regardless of whether the climate is really severely shifts or moderately shifts, or we have an increase in population or a decrease in population, finding more of those kinds of things that we can say and create like consistent policies to keep moving those forward is the challenge. And I think the other piece is really important, and I saw, comment about this in the chat, involving communities, right? Not having things that are processes that are just technocratic and done by a handful of people is really important for these things to persist in the long term. And there are places where, we think certain issues like around stormwater management are not, a lot of times are controlled by authorities or things like that really have no public input into those processes, and thinking about like, are there better ways to spend money in terms of green infrastructure over gray infrastructure, et cetera, are going to be really important issues in the long term for this region.
I just find this fascinating, and it will not be going away anytime soon. In fact, I think our learning, our research, and our studying of this issue is just starting. And Amber, did you see anything in the comments that any questions? I know I kind of ran us over here a little bit, but
I'm looking here. There are a couple in the Q&A that I believe that you could type in and answer. And then there's a couple comments. We need informed, socially inclusive leadership in this area to cope successfully with the opportunity of climate immigration, from Judy Lynch. And yes, agreed. There are quite a few questions in here. So what I'm going to do is I do want to give everyone a break so that we don't zoom people out. But I'm going to package all of these questions together and make sure they get to you guys. And then when we send out the follow-up emails with the surveys and the recording of this webinar, we will make sure that we include those answers. Is that okay for everybody?
Sounds great.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Nick and Terry. Wonderful, wonderful presentation. It's definitely something that we need to be talking about, and I'm so glad that we had you with us today. So for everyone, let's take just a couple minutes for a bio break, and we'll come back here at, let's say 2:15. So you get 2 minutes to turn off your computer. I even gave you an extra minute. Is everyone back? Welcome back. Okay.
Should I just pull my presentation up while we're?
Sure, yeah. All righty. Well, thank you everyone for coming back after that brief break. We are going to take things a little bit closer to home. We're now joined by Sarah Stallman as well as Jeff Harvey, who will follow Sarah in their presentation. And they're going to discuss hazard mitigation in Erie. Sarah is the extension leader for Pennsylvania Sea Grant. She joined the Pennsylvania Sea Grant team in 2006 and became extension leader in July of 2017. Sarah provides statewide leadership and management of the Pennsylvania Sea Grant Extension Program in several key areas, including community resilience, invasive species, water quality, fisheries, watershed restoration, and land use planning. She earned her bachelor's in biology with a minor in psychology from Penn State Behrend and her master's degree in biology from Shippensburg University of Pennsylvania. And Dr. Jeffrey Harvey is a certified emergency manager who has helped communities prepare for disasters since the early 2000s. He holds a doctorate in executive leadership along with a master's in strategic leadership, and his research interest is collaboration in preparedness, response, and recovery. He is the founder and preparedness division manager at JH Consulting, LLC of Buckhannon, West Virginia, as well as a professor of strategic leadership at the University of Charleston in Charleston, West Virginia. So Sarah and Jeff, thank you both for being here, and take it away.
All right, thank you, Amber. All right, so I felt like the last group of presenters did a really great job of kind of introducing the topic, and we're going to take it a little bit more local. You're going to hear some of the same types of things like scenario planning as we go through this. I'm going to start out, I've given updates on CRANE, the Community Resilience Action Network of Erie, in the past, but for the sake of anyone new joining, I'm just going to do kind of a brief overview of CRANE and some of the work that we've been doing, and then kind of how that lends into the hazard mitigation planning process when we turn it over to Jeff. And there we go. Amber, my slides are not moving. There we go. Okay. This happens to me every time I share my screen. All right, so CRANE, Community Resilience Action Network of Erie. If you haven't heard of us, we're essentially a conglomeration of partners. We've got state agency partners, we have private entity partners, municipal, and academia as well. We get together to talk about climate resilience types of issues with specifically a mission to engage our community through collaborative educational opportunities, as well as on the ground activities that will help us to identify various climate vulnerabilities in Erie, as well as develop kind of on the ground projects that will help us to preserve our vibrant and resilient region. So in the past, some of the things that we've done have included annual summits, outreach and educational materials on climate change and specific Erie information, ultimately with the goal of engaging our public and stakeholders with information on climate impacts and actions. We have the PACRANE.org website, so we can kind of provide this web-based information specific to Erie. If you're looking for Erie-specific climate data, precipitation data, water level data, temperature data, that type of information, you'll be able to find it on our website. We've done some tool reviews to help identify out of the hundreds and thousands, it seems like, tools that are available to help communities deal with climate change. We've gone through and identified ones that we have felt are most valuable to our region and have put those on our tools and resources section. And you can also find updates on various projects that we're working on this website. We also work to connect scientific information and data regarding climate change to the community. We've provided technical assistance in the past, including doing flood risk reports, We do infographics and essentially taking scientific information and making it so that it's usable to our decision makers and to our community members. So the Erie's new normal temperature infographic is actually one of our newest pieces, and we're working on doing several of these for precipitation. You can see there's already one for water levels, snow. I know somebody asked a question about specific snow data for Erie. So this is information that has come from GLESA, the Great Lakes Integrated Sciences and Assessments Program, to give us very specific Erie information, not Pennsylvania specific, not Great Lakes region specific, but Erie specific climate data, and then kind of helping to take a lot of that information and make it a little bit more user friendly. So you can kind of get a sample of what those infographics are going to look like. And then also developing climate resilience strategies for the Erie region. And that's going to kind of go into the meat of this presentation and what we've been working on. Here's a picture of our new climate resilience fellow, Nikki Jackson. Some of you may have spoken with them already. They're doing a lot of work in the community, reaching out to different community groups. They're working on a vulnerability background for Erie. I know that it was mentioned in the last presentation how important it is to connect with vulnerable communities with regards to climate change. So Nikki's doing a really great job of pulling all of that information together for Erie and what that looks like here. I've mentioned this project before, preparing Erie for extreme weather, what to do and where to start. Again, this is funded by GLESA. We received $30,000 from GLESA, but we've also had local support from Erie Insurance, as well as support from NOAA and the Sea Grant program. Essentially, this is going to look familiar because the last presentation had this in that kind of 5-point circle form. But we're doing the same thing by following those steps to build resilience here in Erie, by doing things like exploring hazards, assessing vulnerabilities and risk, investigating our options, prioritizing and planning, and then taking action. So this document here, Understanding Erie's Level of Preparedness for Coastal Flooding and Other Weather Disasters, is available on the Crane website. This is essentially a nice summary of the kind of step one process of exploring hazards, and it has some of that climate data in there, but also it focuses on the results of the community-wide hazardous weather survey that we have done. This survey is still open. We used a lot of this information to help inform our process moving forward, but we are still very open to hearing from our community members about their experiences with extreme weather, their perceptions of extreme weather, what they're dealing with, what they're concerned about for the future, and any types of stories, modifications that have needed to be made to homes and businesses and things like that. So if you haven't had a chance to take the survey, please do that. But a lot of that information is summarized in that document. The last presentation mentioned a lot of the different hazards in the Explore Hazards section. This is one that we kind of used the survey to really prioritize where were we going to initially start focusing our efforts in Erie. So based on feedback from the survey, we looked at the top 5 hazards that the community is concerned about now, as well as into the future. And those included snowstorms, high wind events, heavy rain events, and coastal and inland flooding, extreme high and low temperatures. And so as we kind of looked into these hazards and we asked the question, have you experienced any direct impacts from these events in the past 10 years? Almost 60% of people had said yes, and that showed up in the form of things like property damage and structural damage to homes and businesses, coastal erosion, flooding, crop loss, and uncertainty for planning for the future. And 52% of people have indicated through the survey that they have needed to make modifications to homes, businesses, and personal life. Most of the time that came up in the form of things like purchasing generators and sump pumps and other equipment, as well as implementing residential retrofits or new construction. So jumping into step 2, and this is where I'm going to spend a little bit more time, is how we have worked in the assess vulnerability and risk step 2. And what we did was we essentially took a coastal resilience index, which is a formalized vulnerability assessment process that was developed initially in the Gulf states. It was adapted by New York and New York Sea Grant and their team there, and for the Great Lakes region. And then we further adapted that to work for Erie. So essentially, this is a series of questions that municipalities can sit down and answer, and it essentially gives them a grade for how prepared their community is for these different weather scenarios that were identified in the survey. And it's not to sit down and say, you know, your community gets an F. Really, the idea behind this is to help us to identify and prioritize opportunities where future funding opportunities and projects could be kind of that low-hanging fruit and greatest value to help build resilience within Erie County. So we've spent the past several months sitting down with various municipalities and having them complete the Coastal Resilience Index. So far, we have met with Mill Creek, Harbor Creek, Fairview, Girard, Springfield, the City of Erie, and Northeast Borough, and we're continuing to sit down as we can and meet with municipalities to really go through and have conversations about their different vulnerabilities. And I'm just going to kind of summarize this. The CRI, the Coastal Resilience Index tool, was broken into several different categories, including things like critical infrastructure, critical facilities, current mitigation measures, transportation systems, business plans, etc. So they kind of went through each of these sections and answered a series of questions that again help them to identify their vulnerability level in these areas. So this is summarizing through all of the municipalities that we have met with so far. Greatest concerns really were surrounding heavy rainfall, high wind events, extreme freezing, and various temperature fluctuations. And the greatest vulnerabilities were mostly lying within critical infrastructure in these communities, as well as facilities. And focus areas that came up for concern were the power grid, water utilities, as well as transportation. Another thing that kind of came from this is one of the sections, like I mentioned, was business plans. And a lot of our municipalities had a really hard time answering the questions within this section, which essentially helped us to realize that we really don't have a good grasp for the resilience of local grocery stores and businesses for their ability to either remain open or quickly reopen after a hazardous event. So that in itself we identified as a vulnerability. So essentially, based on the information that we found from the series of CRI meetings that we've had so far, you've heard this term already from the previous presentation, we planned a scenario planning workshop. This happened on October 12th. We invited all of the various municipalities. We had representation from township supervisors, code enforcement officers, emergency management staff, quite a few people that came. This was held at the Mill Creek Municipal Township building. And essentially you heard a little bit about scenario planning, but what this is helping us to do is to incorporate uncertainty into decision-making by creating novel scenarios. So not just what is expected based on the past, but what we could potentially look for in the future. This is just an example. I'm not going to read through all of this, but we had as a group, Crane had identified 2 potential weather scenarios. A summer scenario, which included things like 10 days of high heat without things cooling off at night, higher than normal wet conditions, convective storms causing flooding and down trees and power lines and things like that. we essentially broke our participants into breakout groups, and they were given scenarios such as this one to think about, as well as the ability for them to add in optional customization. So if we're talking about Erie and we're talking about lakeshore communities, some of them wanted to include high lake levels in their scenarios. So there was the ability to be flexible and create these scenarios, these narratives, the way that the participants wanted to focus on them and talk about them. And because there were so many ways that we could go with this, we wanted to prioritize based on outputs from the CRI. So again, I had mentioned that transportation and power and water utilities came up quite a bit as concerns for our municipalities. So we kind of made these the two focus areas. So each of the breakout groups was assigned a weather scenario to work with, as well as one of these focus areas. So for example, one of the groups looked at a summer scenario, which I showed previously, and thought about that in the frame of transportation. So these are just some pictures from the scenario planning workshop. So essentially what our participants did was they sat down, they had conversations about these different scenarios and what this would look like for their municipalities. They were able to kind of figure out goals for what they would like to see in their municipalities with regards to their focus area. So I'm trying to think, the group that I was in had transportation, and they were trying to say things like making sure that there is transportation available to evacuate in case of an emergency, and have some kind of plan in place for detour routes. They were able to really just brainstorm and think of different recommendations that they would come up with for these different scenarios. So this was pretty much a full day workshop, and we were actually able to leave with a lot of really great recommendations from each of the groups that we could potentially move forward with into actual on the ground projects. And so that is the kind of the step 3 as I'm moving into the step 4, prioritizing and planning, how we're going to kind of incorporate these results into existing planning. And that's going to be what Jeff talks about a little bit with the hazard mitigation plan. But we also want to continue this process, not just looking at the municipal level, but also holding additional workshops to talk to community members. We'd love to be able to come up with recommendations, both on the municipal level and the community level, and even on the personal level for various residents and steps that they can take. We'd love to model something after the Cleveland Climate Action Plan. This is just an at a glance that they have that does exactly that. It kind of gives examples of steps that can be taken within communities to help build resilience. And so that is ultimately our goal, is to help prioritize and plan the work that we're doing so that it can be usable by the community. And then again, being able to take the information that we're doing and incorporate that into the Erie County Hazard Mitigation 5-year plan. It just so happened that the work that we're doing really mirrors what the county is doing in their planning team with the 5-year update. So it's been a really great partnership to be able to do this with Jeff. And so I'd like to turn it over to Jeff now so that he can kind of move into a little bit more specific on what's going on with the hazard mitigation plan. So thank you.
Hey, thank you very much, Sarah. And give me 1 second here while I transition over and begin to share my screen. Let's see. And this looks like it's going to do the right thing. Hopefully you are seeing my screen right now, and it should look relatively similar to the last slide that Sarah had shown. But yeah, so I've been working with several folks in Erie County, along the lake. Good Lord, it's a good day. But anyway, what I've been really pleased about is that there were a lot of efforts that were already underway that were very consistent with what's going on in Erie County's hazard mitigation plan. So it's that age-old thing about the difference between the composition of a plan and the planning process. So this is a great opportunity to build a lot of these kind of momentum-driven issues for climate resiliency. And I've heard equity mentioned several times today, and that features in a little bit of what we're doing, so that this isn't just a one-off document that's done per a regulatory driver. It's actually something that is trying to capture a more broad-based strategy there in Erie County. So what I want to do is kind of give you a quick real quick overview of hazard mitigation planning. And I'm making an assumption here that many people probably understand what mitigation is, even if I'm just now introducing the term to you, but you may not know about the requirement for communities to do a hazard mitigation plan. So we'll talk a little bit about what that is. And there's some definitions on the screen, and these are my takes on the definitions. So they certainly have an homage to pay to some FEMA doctrine as well as some research, but these are kind of my takes on it. And when you see hazard mitigation and we talk about reduction in damages through sustained action to lessen and eliminate long-term risks to both human life and property from hazards, the risk reduction aspect of that definition is really easy to understand, and it's something that most people connect right to. But there's two aspects of that definition that get overlooked quite a bit. And the first is sustained action, and the second is long-term. So what that means is that communities can and really should welcome the one-off project that looks at a hyper-local area to try to reduce some risks, but not at the expense of the more long-term approach. So true mitigation is a more strategic approach whereby a community seeks to decrease hazard exposure, I would say measurably over time. And it's kind of a contextualized version of systems thinking where, we see mitigation appear in things like community growth discussions, decision-making around local policies, economic development discussions, some of those land use issues that you heard our first two presenters talk about. So mitigation, hazard mitigation, seeks to reduce impacts to both property and human life. And when you think about many of those impacts, the physical is really easy to come to, but yet there's certainly some projects that can seek to address the human aspects itself. So that's a real quick overview of mitigation. A mitigation plan, put simply, is the plan that outlines how a community is going to do that. But let's unpack the definition that's on the screen. Systematically and strategically identified local policies and actions that can be implemented over the long term to reduce risk. What I want to focus on is systematically and strategically. So systematic acknowledges the integration of mitigation into other decisions. None of those things can be done in a vacuum. So the plan is a space where communities can recognize other planning mechanisms that can identify synergies with the hazard mitigation effort. And strategic is maybe the harder one. So strategy by nature involves trade-offs. So there's any number of strategies that a community could implement, but they pick one or two or hopefully several for a certain reason. They can't implement every single one of them. So what's the process that feeds into how communities choose what they want to do over certain other good options? That's strategic thinking kind of in a nutshell and in practice. So the hazard mitigation plan then becomes a way to document how community has prioritized, has come up with some of those conditions, and really gives the reader some insight into what the strategic thinking was at the community level. And quite frankly, it was this systematic strategic consideration that led to the collaboration that Sarah mentioned, all the good efforts that are already going on with Crane. Why would we do this alongside of that? Why would we not integrate a lot of that work that's being done with the hazard mitigation plan? So this is, again, a real serendipitous kind of opportunity. The last thing you should understand about hazard mitigation planning is how we got here, how we got from then to now. And there's a threshold moment that sort of happened about 25 years ago. And that is when basically communities were given the carrot and maybe the stick, depending on your perspective. But we had a regulatory driver that was implemented that tied the presence of an approved adopted hazard mitigation plan to eligibility for federal mitigation funding. So quickly before that, pre-regulatory driver, you saw a lot of recommended things out of the federal government. Certainly risk reduction was considered to be a good thing. But there was no real organized level at the federal level on down to try to lead communities through that process. Now, in the 90s, after some pretty significant flooding in the Midwest, we started to see a little more attention paid to hazard mitigation as a governmental concern, as a community-wide concern, a region-wide concern, maybe even a state or national level concern. And some early programs that tried to work at that, Project Impact was one under the James Lee Witt FEMA that encouraged a lot of local level adoption of mitigation projects. But the point is, all of those were recommendations, and it wasn't until we hit this kind of threshold moment with the advent of the hazard mitigation plan eligibility requirement that we saw widespread adoption of hazard mitigation planning and thus hazard mitigation projects. Now, once that threshold was crossed, it wasn't like we walked into a mitigation utopia. We've cleared some hurdles along the way. So early versions of hazard mitigation plans were very process oriented. It was almost like some parallel considerations of a range of hazards. So it was a mechanistic way to analyze hazards in a consistent way. But there wasn't a lot of overlap between what we looked at impact wise on those hazards. You'll hear me use the term cascading hazards here in a minute. And that was largely absent from some of the early iterations of hazard mitigation plans. So as we've grown, as we've had update cycles, we've added different things into the mitigation plan to provide a more well-rounded overview of what communities should be what risks they should be trying to reduce. And so that first round of updates, we started to see more integration of the whole community. By that point in time, the whole community approach to emergency management had been released and was starting to be adopted. And that's a fancy way of saying that emergency management, including hazard mitigation, needs to be a participatory process. So we started involving more folks in. Originally, it was a lot of local government emergency management types that were in that, because it was hazard stuff, that's emergency management. It had to be adopted, that was local government. So we started bringing in economic development interests, community development interests, civic interests, higher ed interests in that first update, say kind of in the mid to late 2000s. When we got to the second update cycle, I keep talking about an update cycle, these are required to be updated every 5 years. So, about 10 years or so after communities really did their first major formal plan, that second update cycle, we started realizing that risk and vulnerability wasn't accurately described in those neat little siloed approaches. So we started talking about cascading hazards. When you have a severe weather event and it knocks the power grid offline for a while, there's sort of an exacerbation of what impacts we experience in the community. So your plan started to take that into account. And we also started to realize that different segments of the population were impacted by events very differently. So on the whole, it could be a rather minor occurrence, but certain segments of our population may get walloped by that particular event due to various access issues, some other kind of steady state status quo issues related to poverty status, related to some other equity concerns and all those that caused the impact to be felt differently across our communities. So the hazard mitigation planning process is starting to take a little bit of that into effect. So you see that kind of long and winding road in the middle of my slide there. And on the left-hand side, what we're trying to say is we've gone from a very governmental centric approach down to a more community-minded approach. I think we've still got some ways to go there, but we're much better than where we were, say, 20 years ago. And then on the right side of the screen, that siloed risk consideration down to more of an integrated risk and vulnerability consideration. Both of those shifts in thinking have been very necessary. Now, what's on the horizon? So Erie County is working on its plan right now, and it'll be probably submitted, hopefully submitted in the early part of 2023. In the middle of the spring of 2023, the guidelines that govern how to do mitigation planning are going through a refresh. And there's a couple of things that are going to be featured in those refreshed guidelines, and that's climate considerations as well as equity considerations. So essentially what we've got going on here is we're experiencing climate exacerbated hazard impacts. And as we heard from the first presentation, the science is kind of emerging on what those are, but I think there's at least some consensus around the fact that many of these hazards that we look at are just simply different than they were before. So, there's some climate attribution to that, but again, recognition that things are just different and they're not forecasted as easily as what we previously were able to do. So that's kind of going on one side of the house, and that's pulling one direction away from our vision of really resilient communities, because the data that we kind of use to help prepare ourselves is shifting and changing in a lot of ways that we don't expect. The experiences that we have are very different from what the data might suggest. On the other side of that, pulling in another direction, we have a lot of inequity. And what I mean there is that we haven't historically involved all segments of our community in our processes to the level that they should be involved. So we don't have a clear understanding of what challenges our communities are actually facing. So we may write a beautifully crafted plan that only addresses the needs of about a third of our community, and that's caused some different problems. When you put the two of those things together in our classic Venn diagram here, what we're seeing is that those things contribute to an increased vulnerability, because now we understand what are the actual impacts, not just what is the probable risk. We're seeing some degraded community linkages, because we go into areas, we have disasters that occur, and there's various levels of recovery investment that are given in those communities. So the nature of that community is forever altered. And so that's a challenge, and we can look at that from a mitigation side of things. There's a lack of access. The lack of access in the planning process is on the front end, but a lack of access to support and recovery assistance, and ultimately some decisions that are made in long-term recovery, that there's also lack of access there. And then finally, all of these things together are starting to, this is what the disproportionate impacts are. We can talk about those in a very intangible sense, but when we think about what the increased vulnerabilities are, the linkages, the social capital, it's kind of disrupted because of what we've got, that we can see what those disproportionate impacts are. And quickly here, trying to integrate some of these things into Erie County's plan is recognizing anticipated climate impacts for the hazards that are included in the plan. I'm going to list those on the next slide. But as an example, the first presenters talked about urban heat island effect. Well, we can include that in the temperature extreme profile. We can look at areas that have a lot of pavement coverage and things like that and show those. And if we can show where those areas are, that sort of sets the mind frame when we think about where we can consider mitigation projects, actually on the ground actions for that type of a hazard. So we're trying to show some of those climate sensitivities in the hazard profiles. We're also integrating relevant social vulnerability discussions, and that's in the description of our planning area. It's relative to the individual hazards under study, and it's also in some trends discussions where we're looking at a lot of the overlap of the hazards. And then we're trying to create a more equitable process for participating in the plan, both now as it's being updated, but also as a plan maintenance section where, as we consider some of these, or we continue some of these planning efforts that are going on, making sure that we have opportunities to fold a greater segment of a more representative segment of our population into these processes. So 2 more slides for me. The first one here is the hazards that are included in Erie County's plan. And a lot of these are usual suspects by now. We've been talking about them for the past hour and a half or so. I think it's really interesting, the extreme temperature hazard. I had it highlighted in a different color before today's presentation, I promise. But when I heard in the first presentation about how there are some more definitive linkages to that and climate change, this was something that we added this time around. And the addition of that hazard was born out of a lot of what Sarah mentioned earlier with Crane's efforts, that this is something that's on our community's mind. So it's there from a perspective standpoint, but it's also there from kind of the research scientific standpoint. So we really felt we needed to include this one in here. The hazard mitigation planning program only requires that you include natural hazards, but you can see that we've got several other technological and human caused hazards here. And that's good. We want to do that. We as consultants encourage that communities do that, just because it provides a more well-rounded picture of what our communities are actually facing. So the mitigation plan includes a risk assessment section that details these types of hazards very in-depth, thoroughly. And then there's an action plan section that actually lists a lot of those on-the-ground strategies that Sarah had mentioned on a community by community basis. And that action plan sort of forms the impetus for what we want to do over the next 5-year period for the plan. So the last thing I would like to just mention, I'll leave you with ways to participate in this process. And there's still really 3 areas that we can do that. With hazards, this is one of those things where just be thinking about what keeps you awake at night with respect to hazards. Talk about those things with your family, with your community leaders. Certainly you can reach out to me as a member of the hazard mitigation planning team, and we can put some of that input into this particular planning process. Sarah mentioned that Crane's survey is still open about some of those impacts, so I would encourage you to participate in that if you haven't already. Regarding actions, we've got a survey that will launch hopefully in the next 7 to 10 days that's focused on the types of mitigation actions that residents throughout Erie County would be willing to support. So not necessarily a guarantee that things would be done, but types of projects that they would be willing to support. And then finally, with respect to access, we just want to get this on the radar of as many people as possible. So if there are groups that represent various segments of the population that we can get in front of, that we can provide information to, that we can ask for input from, feel free to reach out to me or anybody on the hazard mitigation planning team, and we'll be sure to get those folks folded into the process. So I'm going to stop there. I know I'm about 2 minutes over my agenda time here, so I hope that leaves enough time for some questions. So Amber, I'll go ahead and quit sharing here and let you moderate.
Thank you so much, both of you, Sarah and Jeff. That was wonderful. Let's see if we have any questions. First, Tim, do you have any questions?
I do have questions, but I see that there's a few on the question and answer section, and I'd like to try to get to those ones.
Okay. Okay, so the first one that I'm seeing is what demographic metrics are being used in combination with the hazard assessment to help assess mappable risk across the map? I'm not sure, Jeff or Sarah, who wants to tackle that one.
So I'll take a stab at it, and then Sarah, I would invite you to add whatever you think would be appropriate for that. So there's some basic demographic indicators in there: age, gender, location, population density, certain things like that. I mentioned some of our social vulnerability indicators, and that's where we tease into the demographics a little bit deeper. So, this is again broad brush, but educational attainment, access to reliable internet, let's see, single family households, reliable transportation, things like that. And the way that we try to overlap that with some of the hazard discussion is what are relevant. So when you look at a, say, communicable disease as a hazard, there's a fair amount of evidence out there that suggests that, both ends of the age spectrum are disproportionately impacted by that. So as we go through that discussion, we can show where the heavier densities of the very young, where the heavier densities of our elderly populations are, and try to kind of spatially reference the line of thinking with respect to those hazards there. So that's a quick example, quick couple of categories. Sarah, anything to add to that?
No, I think you hit most of the same ones that we're looking at. Maybe I'm not sure if you talked about housing. Some of the areas that we're looking at is, people that are in mobile home units, people that are renters, those types of things as well. Also looking at the availability of social systems and social support systems within the different communities that we're working with as well.
Great, thank you. The next question, I think in the Q&A, these two are related. So if you want to read those in there, I'll read them to you, but it might be helpful if you also read along. They're kind of long. So what kind of scale will the risk assessment be conducted at? For example, block by block, by multi-block sectors or by zip code or municipality sized regions. And then the follow-up is, for context, I was thinking along the lines of a recent risk assessment on the Lithuanian coast. And you can see the reference there. So any thoughts on that?
So that's a great question. I can speak to it from the mitigation plan standpoint. It really is on a kind of municipality by municipality basis. And the reason for that is just a regulatory driver there, has the adoption element to it. So we want to give this in manageable chunks for our municipalities. Obviously, there's some interrelated discussions that are going on there. Our risks and things don't honor the geopolitical boundaries we have. But I think for usability on the adoption side of the things, the mitigation plan looks at it municipality by municipality.
Great, thank you. Okay, and then one more question in the Q&A. Does the hazard mitigation plan include potential disasters associated with oil and gas infrastructure? Does it specifically speak to transportation of oil by rail, often called bomb trains?
So the quick answer to that is yes. It goes in a couple of different areas, and it's not necessarily specific to oil and gas. It's more specific to a couple of things. The first is infrastructure generally. So there's some interest in the state of infrastructure as that relates to how it contributes to risk and vulnerability. So infrastructure decay type things, aging of systems, safety and security of critical infrastructure systems. I think the other side of that coin is in what's labeled as environmental hazards, which is where we can include some hazardous material considerations. So that's not specifically just transport by rail. It's commodity transport by various transportation modes: rail, highway, waterway, airway, and then also some fixed facility considerations with respect to hazmat.
Thank you.
I'll also follow up on that to Jenny Tompkins, talking about some of those external factors, the environmental risk factors, specifically regarding large oil spills. The Great Lakes Restoration Initiative in Pennsylvania provided a grant to the Erie County emergency folks to create and buy 5 different spill response trailers that are stationed across the Pennsylvania Lake Erie coastline that would reduce the response time to any type of potential oil spill that would occur in our streams that lead to the lake. And so in some respects, I think that's absolutely something that should be included, inside of a comprehensive mitigation plan. But we've also been working towards that individually throughout the past year.
That's great. Thanks, Tim. Okay, and then there's one last question, and Jeff, I'm not sure if you'll be able to answer this, but Judy Lynch would like to know if you would do a walkthrough of Kelso or Bear Beach to see the hazards that are there.
So I appreciate your comment, Judy, and I see that Joy has responded to that in the chat feed as well. But I think whenever we are there and do some of our site visits in person, I would welcome the opportunity to be able to see some of these things with locals. We do a lot to try to understand the local perspective, and the participation that we've had so far has been great. But there is no substitute for for being there and seeing it in real time. So the next time we're planning to be there for a series of actions, if we can coordinate that, I'd be happy to.
That's great. Thank you. Okay, that looks to be all of our questions. Tim, do you have any final comments?
No, I just want to thank both Sarah and Dr. Harvey for those updates, as well as our previous presenters. I think it's been a great meeting so far, and we're happy to follow up with anyone on additional questions or comments that they might have. And I'll turn it back over to you.
Sounds great. Thank you so much. So just a few closing items here. This does bring us to the end of our LEAF meeting, and I just dropped a link into the chat for a form. If you would be so kind to help us learn what you want to know about and learn from your experiences, fill out that form. The form will also come with the recording and notes from the meeting, and everything will also be available on Pennsylvania Sea Grant's website at seagrant.psu.edu. So thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you at the next LEAF meeting. Trying to stop the recording.